It's time for this week's episode of Brandon Sports Talk, featuring in-depth interviews from those who are trending in the world of athletics. And now, here's the host of Brandon Sports Talk, Brandon Pate.
Welcome back to Brandon Sports Talk. In today's episode, I have the privilege to interview the owner of the Soccer Over Gotham soccer podcast, Gary Gibson. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. I really do appreciate you reaching out to me. And I know you've interviewed a lot of Gotham players. And so I'm happy to join that group of players that have been on your podcast.
That's so exciting. Can you talk about, of course, how you knew that you wanted to start a sports soccer podcast?
Soccer is part of my DNA. It's in my blood. I've been doing it since I was so I was able to stand, had a ball at my feet. So soccer has always been a part of my life. And recently, I've been a fan of a men's soccer team that had many podcasts. I used to listen to a bunch of them. So through listening to like the experts and fan opinions, I would often find myself saying, "But that's not what happened," or "Yeah, that happened, but that's not why that happened. There's so much more to what just happened here that you're missing." Like a goal doesn't just become a goal. There's always a sequence of events or circumstances that create that goal. And that's that's been missing from the podcast that I was listening to. So during the pandemic, I decided to go back to college, finish my degree in sports management. And I spent way too much time in real estate, and I wanted to get back to the sport that I love. So I needed to get back, and I knew that my time away, I needed to learn a lot. I wasted too much time. I had a lot of catching up to do, a whole lot of learning. And what better way to learn than by interviewing people who are in the sport, athletes, and trying to figure out exactly where it is that I fit into that world of women's sports. So one of the tenets that I live by is being accessible to power, and knowledge is power. So I want to be around people that are knowledgeable, that know the sport, that have a map, and can show me how they did what they did. So I've just been immersing myself and just going headfirst into learning about the sport.
How did you come up with the name of the podcast, Soccer Over Gotham?
So one of my many superpowers is I'm good at creating names for businesses, and my friends always ask me to help them pick names out for their businesses or stuff. So for me, it's just fun. So when it comes to branding rules, it should always be immediately recognizable as to what it is. As we talked earlier, like you saw the logo and you were like, okay, that's a soccer podcast for Gotham FC. I can see that right away. And like your podcast is a perfect example of that. Brandon Talks Sports. People know as soon as they see Brandon Talks Sports that there's a guy named Brandon, and that's you, and you talk sports. It's a perfect branding exercise because there's so many like podcasts out there, especially sports podcasts. You'll see it's like the burning weasel finds an apple, and they cover Orlando FC. Like, how is anyone going to be able to see that and think Orlando soccer podcast, right? So you want something that it is a play on words. It is something that is indicative of what you're looking to cover. So when people see it, they go, okay, soccer podcast, Gotham FC, I get it. So for our podcast, I was just playing around with the name Gotham and trying to figure out something that worked. It was catchy. It had to do with soccer. And then I was just plugging away at the computer, and I found there was a song called Sky Over Gotham. It's one of the video games, something like that. And I was like, soccer over Gotham. It works. Got it. It says soccer over the city of Gotham. It's perfect. I just knew it right away.
Of course, how did you know that you wanted to obviously cover the NWSL soccer team of New York, New Jersey, Gotham FC versus anything else?
There's a million reasons, but I'll give you a couple. So women's soccer, frankly, and women's sports in general, is just underinvested given the return on that investment. It is stupid to not invest in women's sports at this point. The return on investment is incredible. So when it came to this team, I've been a fan of this team for years. And I knew that I wanted to help the sport of women's soccer grow. And as my local team, I love that team. And saw a couple podcasts that were put out for the team, and there is room for everybody in the sporting podcasting world. There doesn't need to be just one podcast, but I felt like we were talking about earlier, what was missing from that block of podcasts. So I said, you know what? I know where my lane is. I'm going to go hop in there, start a women's podcast. It's going to be me and my partner, and we're going to cover this team best we can and give this team a professional level podcast that they deserve. These women work so hard and they're underpaid and they need more coverage, and they need professional coverage, not just some fans just sitting there talking about the sport. We need a consistent professional level podcast that really highlights the team and amplifies their voice.
Of course, with talking about that, obviously giving them the platform to have that professional podcast. What has that been like? Obviously, giving the New Jersey, New York, Gotham FC that professional platform.
So it is a privilege to do this, and I take it very, very seriously. I want to get better every single show, and as we talked about earlier, I wanted a crash course in women's soccer, and last year I got one. It was more than I bargained for at times. There was a reckoning in the sport last season, and it felt like every other episode we had to address some kind of scandal or tragic event. It was heartbreaking. It was powerful. But it allowed me to learn so much about systems of power and ultimately the abuses of that power. I had the privilege of learning and listening and amplifying the voices of people that were victims, and I got to be an agent for positive change. So this podcast allows me to be an ally for people and for underdeserved people, underdogs, and be an advocate for marginalized groups. So something that I know it's a privilege that I have, and I'm going to use that to amplify that. So that is an absolute privilege of this. And I enjoyed every minute of it. I learned so much. And this is a perfect bridge between my podcast is a Trojan horse. So the Trojan horse is I love amplifying women's voices. I love rooting for women. So this is a way for me to do that and amplify women's voices. But it also was a way for me to learn more about the sport. And it also allows me to do more charitable work. I do so much charity on my own time. I'm a big brother. I work for animal sanctuaries. I do all these good things. This allows me to amplify that side of my side of my being too. There's a supporter group, Cloud9, who is one of the best supporter groups in all of soccer, and they do a lot of charity too. So I'm able to amplify their voice, and they do so much to empower the sport and move the sport forward in a safe and create a direction for the players. So this whole thing has just been a big privilege for me to do. And I'm so excited. And I didn't know any of this when I got started, but it's awesome.
What are some of obviously the privileges that you've had with covering obviously the soccer team?
Yeah. So as we mentioned, it's a privilege to amplify these women's voices. These women work 2 jobs, play soccer, they're underpaid, underappreciated, especially in sports. And anything I can do to amplify their voice is a privilege to me. And I get to talk to some of these players who are they're just amazing people because they have so many barriers to break, and they have so many hurdles to jump through that normal athletes or men athletes don't get to have to go through. So it's a privilege to be able to amplify their voices.
Of course, who are some of the privileged people that you have had the privilege of interviewing?
So when I started this podcast, I wanted to be a professional level podcast where we would be game recaps and then interviews. And I wanted to learn more about the sport itself, the athletes, and people who cover sports. So again, this is an education for me as well. So I've had the privilege. One thing I really love about women's soccer is that the players are accessible. You've had a couple on your podcast, and they were great interviews. And I've been amazed on how willing those players are to talk to us, because we're still new at this, but we're still growing. But we've talked to Mandy Freeman last week, and she was just an amazing player. And you did Mandy Freeman. No, you did not do Mandy Freeman. You did Jean Lewandowski. We talked to her. We talked to Brianna Pinto from North Carolina Courage now. We talked to Casey Murphy of the national team. We talked to Paige Monahan. And actually, one of my favorite little interviews we did last year was with Shep Messing, who's a New York soccer legend, U.S. soccer legend. and he was just so engaging. And he told so many about Long Island soccer, about how his love for soccer and how he tried to buy Gotham twice. And we didn't know that going into the interview. It's fascinating. So this is what it's all about. It's just about learning and finding out where I fit in this world.
What was it like, obviously, getting to interview players that are on Gotham FC?
It is a privilege to do that as well. And these players are so much fun. They're so engaging. They're so smart. And all these women on these teams they're all like, they're college graduates. They're brilliant, and they're just so multi-talented and faceted. So like, I always structure our interviews so that I get to know them as a player, but I really want to know them as a person. So I love asking them about their upbringing, how they got into soccer. Then you always have to find that kind of fun questions that bring out their fashion side, make them excited about wanting to talk to you. So like last week, we talked to Mandy Freeman, and one of the fun things about Gotham FC is that they do these fit walks before games, and they're incredible. The women look amazing. And as an athlete, when you look good, you feel good, it brings you some confidence, and that confidence pulls over to game time. So it was really cool to pick her brain on her fashion sense, her fashion style, who she liked to see, who she always wants to know, what's this player wearing? Like, those are so much fun to get to know that player, not just as an athlete, but as a person.
What was it like, obviously, having Gina Lewandowski on your show?
Gina is one of the smartest soccer players you're ever going to meet. So whenever she plays, you just watch her and you know that she's seen everything before, and that she is just tenacious. And I love that about her. And she's so competitive, and she's smart, and she's from this area, which I'm living in now. So I moved from New Jersey to Pennsylvania, and she's from the surrounding area. So we have that kind of connection. I coached the Bethlehem Special Olympics. She's from Coopersburg, which is right next door. So we had this little connection, but she's just an amazing person. She's got a super high soccer IQ. You can tell she's super competitive, and she always gives back to the community around her. I always see her doing charity stuff.
Of course, what is it like, obviously, going to the Gotham SC games to cover it for your podcast?
I've been a fan of the New York Red Bulls before I was a fan of Gotham. So they play at Red Bull Arena, and you walk into Red Bull Arena and you're awed by that place. The pitch is perfect. The stadium is built as a cathedral to soccer. The stadium is built with an overhang that keeps the sound in. So whether it's 1,000 people or 20,000 people, it is loud. It is energetic. It is just an amazing place to watch sports. So I loved that arena before I even became a fan of Gotham. And then when Gotham got the chance to play in Red Bull Arena, it was just the perfect atmosphere, because finally these women were getting a professional level arena. They played in Piscataway on this crappy dirt field it felt like a high school field. So for them to play in Gotham in Red Bull Arena is amazing, and it's just one of the most incredible things that's happened to that team. So covering this team is awesome, because the players, again, are just so enthusiastic. They're so talkative. They're so engaging. So I loved it, and everybody so far along the way has been super accommodating to us. Again, we're just a little podcast that just started a year ago. We're growing. We're one of the top sports podcasts for women, and we're the top team-specific women's soccer podcast. And we've only been going at this for almost a year. So to be able to contact the team and say, hey, we want to interview this player, we're thinking of maybe doing like one player a month. And they're like, yeah, sure, absolutely. So we've been doing one player a month every month, and it's been great. They've been super accommodating. The press people are really cool, and everybody, not just with Gotham FC, but in women's sports and women's soccer in general, have this shared vision of growing the sport. So everybody wants everybody to do well. Everybody's here to help each other. We all talk to each other, and it's an amazing collective of people that are just all doing this a lot of times for free, and they put their hearts into it, which is awesome.
What has it been like, obviously, to go through the communications department for Gotham SC to get those amazing players?
It has been really good. Even when we first started, just getting a media pass, the first thing you should do as a team podcast that wants to cover a team is, obviously, if you're local, you want to be able to go to games first. Go to games, get in the press booth, get those questions after the game in the pressers, just so they can see your face and they can see, okay, they're here to cover us, they're doing a good job, they want to be here and they want us to grow. We'll feed them players. So just make your presence known, ask the right questions, be cordial, and just build a rapport. And we reached out to them again through email. You always got to go to the communications director first. Always do it the right way. You can, as we first started, we used to like DM players and stuff, but as we talked about earlier, sometimes it's not the most appropriate way to do that. So always go to the comms director first, see if that works, and go from there.
Of course, what is something that you learned now that you didn't know before covering a sports podcast for a soccer team?
I didn't know anything when I started. All I know is that I liked a couple podcasts. There was one podcast which I really love. It's called the Seeing Red podcast. It covers Red Bulls New York. And I remember there was one question to Mark Fishkin, and the question was like, why are they successful, or what is it about them that's successful? And he said, format is everything. And I didn't know what he meant by that. But then when I started putting a podcast together, I realized, okay, he's exactly right. Format is everything. So one thing I really learned about myself, though, is that I'm really good at structuring podcasts so that they flow and tell a story. Every podcast that I do, I'm learning something new. So I replay every podcast that I do, and I go, okay, that worked, that didn't work. That question worked, but I didn't ask it in the right way. Okay, maybe I need to do this. Maybe I need to do that. Maybe there's an editing trick I didn't know before. And as you go, and as you know, you make mistakes as you go. You knock over some hurdles. You just got to keep going. But every week you go, okay, I made this mistake. How do I fix that? Okay, I got to learn a new editing trick to do that. So just there's so many things to learn in this. And they tell you when you first start that you can just plug in your phone and have a podcast, which is true, but you're never going to get anywhere if you're just doing the bare bones, the bare minimum. Putting a podcast together takes a lot of time, takes a lot of energy, takes a lot of resources, but get into it, be a professional, learn the trade, learn editing, all that stuff. So the most important thing I learned was consistency is everything.
Of course, if you could interview one person, who would it be on the Gotham FC?
Midge Purse. There's no question, Midge Purse. I'm working my way up to her because she is just incredible as just a human being. She's a Harvard graduate. She's brilliant, and she's funny, and she's got all these incredible talents, and she's an incredible soccer player too. But I want to pick her brain. She talked at the White House. I can't imagine doing it. I'm curious to know like what's more nerve-wracking, like taking it to millions of people. It's pretty crazy.
Of course, what would it feel like to interview Carly Lewandowski?
So you're talking about Gina Lewandowski or Carly Lloyd?
Carly Lloyd, my bad.
Carly Lloyd, I actually would like to pick her brain. She is the most singularly focused player I've ever seen on the planet. You're talking like Messi and Ronaldo type intensity. There's nothing else in her life that was not soccer in her glory. So I really want to pick her brain as an athlete and see what really makes her tick. Because I think one of the ways I relate to players is that I'm a former professional myself, and I have the mindset of an athlete, so I can relate to players on that level. So it's fascinating to me to see someone who has the mindset I have, but just times 100. So I would love to kind of pick her brain on the mental side of the game.
What advice would you give people looking to start their own sports teams podcasts?
Honestly, I have so much advice to give because I'm a lifelong learner, and everything that I do, I want to learn and I want to teach others. It's just what I do. I want to learn things, tell people, and then make them better than I could be. So what's up next for me is I'm going to start a YouTube channel that's just going to be how to grow a podcast and all the things I've learned in this first year. But I will say, as we talked about earlier, consistency is everything. This goes for every single thing that you do. You need to be consistent with your podcast can be found. So if people want to know where they can find your podcast, it's this place every week. You need to be consistent with your content. You need to be consistent with your voice, consistent with your point of view. Come out the same time every week, whatever timing that you choose. It could be a monthly podcast, a weekly podcast, whatever. People want to know that on Thursday, they can turn on their phone, click on Soccer Over Gotham, and they're going to get a new podcast every week like clockwork. They know what they're going to get, what they're coming to you for, and what they're going to get out of it. So be consistent with everything. So for our podcast, I really want to focus this year on doing 20 to 25 minutes of just game recaps and talking about the team, and then 20 to 25 minutes of an interview. Boom, boom. People know that when they click on the podcast, they can go, I only want to hear the interview this week. So go right to 20 to 25, skip the talk, go right to the interview every time like clockwork. So it's a format that works for us. Other things I would say would be, be respectful of your audience's time. Like, again, our audience knows what they're coming to us for and what they're going to get out of it. They know if they come for the interview, again, they can go to 2 minutes 25. Other things would be like audio is everything. Editing is everything. Having the right co-host is everything. Knowing your audience is everything. So building an audience takes time. They say most podcasts fail after their 7th episode because they either A, run out of things to talk about, or they don't realize how hard it is to build an audience. So it takes time, and you got to know who your audience is and how to capture them. And that's what I'm going to build that YouTube channel for, just so I can get those ideas out there. And then people like you can comment, and we can work on this thing together. We can grow sports podcasting together. So that's what I'm trying to do.
What advice would you give people looking to start their own women's sports team podcast, such as yourself did?
Honestly, everything we talked about there, but I would say, what was that? There is not enough women's soccer podcasts. So I would say just start one and listen to other women's sports podcasts. Some of the ones that are my favorites are the Dash podcast that cover Houston. I also really like the Purple Pulse podcast out of Orlando. Those are friends of the show. They're good people and they do a good job. But start your own podcast, find a name that fits, but honestly, just do it. And realize that you're not doing just a normal podcast. You are there to grow this sport and amplify women's voices.
That's great advice. Where can my listeners find you on social media?
Yeah, so we are Over Gotham Pod on Twitter, soccerovergotham.com, soccerovergotham@gmail.com. You can find us on Instagram. I think it's also Over Gotham Pod, or maybe just Soccer Over Gotham. Not on Instagram as much as I should be, but mostly on Twitter. But Ruby's handles our Instagram side. But when it comes to a podcast, is finding the right co-host. So for me, when I started the podcast, I wanted to make sure that it wasn't just two dudes talking about soccer. I wanted it to have a women's perspective, and eventually, we'll see what happens in 2 years when I finish graduating and I, move on to big things. Maybe I will leave this podcast to 2 women. We'll see, but hopefully, I get to do this for a long time.
That's great advice. Thank you again for your interview, and best of luck in your future with the Soccer Over Gotham soccer podcasts.
Absolutely, Brandon. Thank you so much for doing this. And I really appreciate what you do. And let's grow this sport together.
Thank you. You can find Brandon Sports Talk on Facebook at Brandon Sports Talk, Instagram at Brandon Sports Talk, Twitter at Talker_Brandon, and you can find me on YouTube at Brandon Sports Talk. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you again, Gary, for your interview, and best of luck in your future.
Thank you. You too.
You've been watching Brandon Sports Talk. Please feel free to like, share, and subscribe to Brandon Sports Talk on social media and on YouTube.